My name is Danica Katovich. I'm the National Co-Director of CODEPINK. And welcome to our book club for Our Grief Is Not a Cry for War by Jeremy Varon. We are so lucky to be joined by the author as well as Anne Wright for our discussion today. Our Grief Is Not a Cry for War, the movement to stop the war on terror by Jeremy Varon tells the history of the movement and that challenges the logic of endless war in the wake of the war on terror, from grassroots demonstrations and civil disobedience to global protest actions that brought millions into the streets. Through the movement that through the movement that could not stop the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it reshaped public debates, nurtured new forms of activism, and expanded the boundaries of dissent. Today's book club will explore that story, the motivations, the strategies, and the challenges and the lessons of that a generation of organizers left for us all. Jeremy is a professor of history at the New School in New York City and a longtime peace activist and an anti-torture activist. And Anne Wright has been part of the peace community for 20 years and serves as a member of the Code Pink Board of Directors, and we're very, very lucky to have her. Before that, she was in the U.S. Army and Army Reserves for 29 years and retired as a colonel. And she was also a U.S. diplomat and served in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She resigned from the U.S. government in March 2003 in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq, and she's been an active member of Code Pink for 20 years now. Has been on Code Pink trips to Gaza, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Yemen, and Cuba. So we're really lucky to have you both on, and I wanted to have ample time for questions from the group here. So I'll start with a few broad questions for our guests, and I'll field some questions from you all as well who joined us. Um, and feel free as the discussion goes on, especially if you consider yourself a shy person and don't want to ask during the discussion. If you have any questions, you can include them in the chat and I'll try and get to them towards the end of the program. Um, just out of curiosity for the audience, and I'll look for hand raises or if you want to put it in the chat as well. Who was able to get their hands on the book and who's been able to read some of it? It's okay if you haven't. We'll still have like a worthwhile discussion. But okay, Rosalind's read it. Oh, I can't see everything. Hold on. Okay, I've read it, and I know Anne's read it. Elizabeth's read it. Okay, great. So it's fine if you haven't, because I feel like after this you'll really, really want to get your hands on a copy. Because it's really great. Okay, Jean started it. Amazing. Okay, great. So let's get into the discussion with our two guests. I'm going to start with Jeremy. Could you tell us more about why you picked the title? In the intro, you cited as like a rallying cry for the anti-war movement at the time. But what really stuck out to you about this phrase, and why did you want to use it as the title of your book?
Okay, thank you. And then thanks to Code Pink for hosting this book club. I had like the honor and the pleasure of working with a lot of Code Pink's founders back in the day. I always admired the organization. And as I researched more and more its many activities in the early years of the anti-war movement, my estimation of it, only grew. And then Code Pink is one of the real protagonists of this book that appears, over sort of many, many pages and many, many years. As to the title, it's Our Grief Is Not a Cry for War, right? So it's very poetic and very evocative. And it actually is a slogan that was coined just days after 9/11 by an African American artist in New York City named Dred Scott. And he got together with a bunch of artists, and they wanted to capture the outrage that they and a lot of other people in New York felt, that their grief and the tremendous trauma and suffering of New Yorkers was being exploited, particularly by national leaders, as a cause for a heavily militarized response to 9/11 when other options were in principle available. One of the very first peace vigils was people wearing placards with the slogan on it in Union Square, and that was sort of beamed to the world. And the slogan, captures a very important sentiment of many New Yorkers. New York, of course, was the primary target of the 9/11 attacks, but it also was in many ways the epicenter of the anti-war movement. And a lot of New Yorkers were, of course, outraged by 9/11, wanted vengeance, but a lot of other New Yorkers didn't. And their thinking was that 9/11 was so terrible because of the cruel wasting of civilian life and all the death and destruction rained down on regular people. And if the American response created civilian victims half a world away, it wouldn't avenge the crime of 9/11. In some sense, it would repeat it. Right. So our grief is not a cry for war originated in New York. It became adopted by people all over the world who wanted to say, don't believe that, endless war is to the benefit of my security and my safety and in any sense reflects my values. And then it's worth saying that, some family members of folks killed on 9/11 also were advocates for peace and had the message, don't think that you're honoring my loved one or in any sense, accommodating my pain and suffering by, waging war. It's not what my deceased loved one would have wanted. It's not what I want. We want true security, true justice, and true peace based in diplomacy, conflict resolution, and some means other than war making.
Thank you. And it was really interesting to read from my perspective as I've been involved with Code Pink for 6 years, but I was like a toddler when Code Pink first got started. And I'm super in tune, obviously, now with Code Pink's dynamics and what we do on a day-to-day basis. But and I've also talked to Medea and Jody and Anne at length about the early days of Code Pink. But it was really interesting to read it from a third person's perspective, outside the organization on like what people were making of it at the time and just generally around the war on terror at the time. Because I often, get secondhand accounts, if the people I'm surrounded by aren't very political, that were around me at that time, like family members or family friends and that sort of thing, who didn't know internal movement dynamics, I think it just gave me a whole new perspective on everything. So I really appreciate you sharing the history of the name with us. Um, and Code Pink, like I said, has been around for 20 years. And this book captures like the inception of Code Pink, like not just its first actions, but what came immediately before it. And if for people who have joined since the intros and resigned from the State Department at the outset of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So Anne, what do you remember from that time in the movement, and what do you remember of Code Pink specifically before you got involved and maybe immediately after?
Well, first, I want to congratulate Jeremy on a monumental book, really. I mean, nobody else has attempted to capture as much of what happened in those really momentous years of from 2000, September 11th, 2001 on into, 2021 or whenever you finished it. And uh, uh, reading through the book, it was like, geez, man, we ought to be tired because we were putting the pedal to the metal to try to stop that war in Iraq. And I was kind of a late comer to it. As Danica mentioned, I was a part of the system. I was part of the evil enemy in a way. Had been in the military, but by that time I had retired, and then I was a U.S. diplomat. And I ended up, as a diplomat, I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001, when, the anti-war movement was starting to move. It wasn't moving yet for Iraq because nobody knew for sure what was going to happen with that. The Bush administration hadn't said any more than the axis of evil sort of thing. So for Jeremy to really start at the very, very beginning of it, and with this cry, this is not a cry. Our grief is, say the title again, Our Grief is Not a Cry for War. I remember that from the first time I think I ever heard it was in Afghanistan when a group of the 9/11 Peaceful Tomorrow's people came to Afghanistan and came to the U.S. Embassy to say, you guys are now representing the U.S. here, and this should not be in our name that all of this killing will happen. And then I ultimately went on to a next assignment, which was in Mongolia, and that's where I was when I resigned in March of 2003. And then, as a person that had spent most of her adult life in the US government, 8 presidential administrations, and all of them essentially war machines, uh, to resign. And then I didn't know one person in the anti-war movement in the United States. I knew dissidents in other countries where I'd served as a diplomat, because your job was to know people from all walks of life. But I really didn't know anybody in the US um, anti-war movement. And Veterans for Peace was the first organization that I came upon, which Jeremy details, the Arlington West series of crosses out in Santa Barbara and Santa Monica. And then from Veterans for Peace, first time I ever ran into Code Pink was in 2004 at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. And I was there because the Vets for Peace had its convention right before that. And here were these 2 women that were dressed up in all pink, and we're talking crazy stuff about, well, we've got to give Bush the pink slip. He can't be nominated again. He can't, run the country again. And they were saying, you've got to come to join us in New York, because we're really going to put the hammer onto the Republican National Convention. We're going to have pink slips. We're going to line the Broadway. We're going to line everything in our pink slips. And, here I was, a retired Army colonel, a former diplomat, and it was like, no way in the world am I wearing a pink slip. But I did go on, and Jeremy chronicles so much of the things that Code Pink did, and it's flavorful. There's colorful things that really get attention and make people stop to think. And the other thing I will also mention, besides Vets for Peace, Code Pink Women for Peace, I really appreciate, Jeremy, that you really went into detail on the formation of United for Peace and Justice, the umbrella organization that tried to bring as many groups from all over the country into one organization that could help mobilize very quickly lots of people. So congratulations again, Jeremy. It's a great book.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, Jeremy starts talking about the impressions of Code Pink in those early days, like around page 120, if anyone wants, who hasn't gotten their hands on it, wants to make note of that. Introducing our history, our tactics. Jeremy mentions, you mentioned our early delegations to Afghanistan and Iraq, our work to bring victims of the U.S. wars here to speak for themselves, our tactic of, going to where the media already is, which I can confirm is still something we'd like to do. Um, and like I said, I was a toddler when Code Pink was founded. Can you give me a glimpse into what it meant for Code Pink to enter the scene at that point in history?
Sure. I mean, so Code Pink was a major player in the anti-war movement. And then I would put it alongside Veterans for Peace, as Anne mentioned, Iraq Veterans Against the War, and Voices in the Wilderness as the most prominent or significant grassroots anti-organization. Women-led substantially, though not exclusively, made up of women. And, the work of Code Pink, in a sense, started before the organization even existed. Medea Benjamin was already a prominent activist working for global exchange, fighting against economic inequality around the globe. When the invasion of Afghanistan started, there were all these government reports of smart bombs hitting, terrorist targets. And she thought, this can't be true. Missiles aren't that smart. She went to Pakistan trying to go to Afghanistan to see for herself on the ground if this war was as surgical as the United States advertised. She brought with her daughter. I believe Jody Evans was on that initial trip, and they met refugees pouring out of Afghanistan talking about the destruction of their villages, the bombing of their homes, the killing of parents, grandparents, etc. She came back to the United States, held a press conference. Not a single American media organization showed up. And she decided, geez, we're the wrong messengers. So she went back in January, leading a delegation of 9/11 family members, to which Anne just referred, right? Who visited hospitals and orphanages and set in motion a process for the US government to give compensation, meaningful compensation, to the civilian victims of its own war making. And this is the first time in the history of American warfare that a program like this had been set up. So early on, there was a commitment to going in theater in dangerous circumstances and trying to get a sense of the reality of war and give comfort and sympathy and empathy to the victims of American war making. Then back in the United States, the campaign at a certain point shifted towards preventing war with Iraq. And as you know, there was a long run up before the war started. Medea and Jody engaged in a famous disruption of Rumsfeld when he was testifying before the Armed Services Committee in the House. And that was kind of the inaugural Code Pink disruption of Congress that is now part of your sort of repertoire, and arguably that for which Code Pink is most well known. And then launched this thing called the Preemptive Women's Strike for Peace, which was a months-long demonstration stretching from November 2002 to March 2003, right up to the eve of war. And then thousands of people participated in this vigil, including celebrities and people like Alice Walker. And then it became a magnet for women all over the country, some international women, to come and plead to the would-be war makers, sort of don't do this. And then that was the point in which Code Pink kind of came together as a concept and a brand. And then thereafter was just tenacious and indefatigable in trying to prevent war and then trying to end the war in Iraq. And as a result, limit the death and destruction and save lives. And it had a constant presence in all manner of anti-war activity and infused the movement with a spirit that was joyful and community-based and celebrated the agency and collective activism of women, but at the same time was fierce and serious and purposeful, willing to take on risks, and interested in changing hearts, changing minds, and ultimately changing policy. Not just speaking truth to power, but forcing the powerful to change their decisions. And this is in part, I think, a reflection of the experience of the founders, who were women in their late 30s, sort of 40s, who had been professional campaigners, activists, advocates for many years, who had a skill set, some sense of how to change political dynamics, and some wins under their belt, and then went about the business of activism with a tremendous amount of heart and strategic focus. And when I think of Code Pink, I think first and foremost of the hand of compassion offered by North American women to sisters, mothers, daughters suffering at the hands of American violence. And then this kind of confrontational, in-your-face, results-oriented agitation that declares itself completely not okay with death, destruction, torture, invasion. And then I would like to think that today's Code Pink, though with a much larger portfolio of issues, is beholden to that vision. And then you, Danica, might think, oh, Code Pink is this cool organization that does a bunch of things. Rumor has it has its origins in Iraq, right? I'll forever think of it as this anti-Iraq war group that evolved and now does all of this other stuff. And then, the truth is, a blend of our perspectives, but it's left a powerful legacy and now is a permanent part of the progressive American political landscape, with connections on Capitol Hill, with powerful allies in the public sphere, trying to argue that peace is always better than war. that diplomacy is always better than, threats and coercion and kidnappings and violence. And I think the world sorely needs not just an anti-war movement, but a genuine peace movement. And then Code Pink thinks of itself as a peace organization in a way we used to have in the 70s and 60s. And then it's a vital sort of conscientious part of our politics, and I hope it continues thriving.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. I hope so too. Yeah, it's been interesting to read about when I was reading about Code Pink in your book and how like the emphasis on feminism was there or how it became like a women's organization. Because like recently, like not recently, maybe 4 years ago, we had changed our, website. It was like Code Pink is a women's led organization. We changed it to feminist led organization a few years ago. Um, and I think we had at the time a really unique framework for understanding like how the US was weaponizing women's rights to promote war. And I don't think that much has changed at all. And I think it's still a space we occupy because Western feminism still tends to use these talking points. And we heard it with Gaza in the last 3 years is do you not care about women's rights in Gaza? And it's like, well, they're being bombed, and I think that's my priority at this given moment. Why would it not be yours? Um, so it's kind of it was interesting reading like people's perspective from like that period versus now, like how much has not really changed. Um, so thank you for that. And I want to say we will be moving on to like a discussion portion in a few minutes. So if you have questions, get them ready because I would love to call on you to get the discussion started. Um, so this question is for both Anne and Jeremy. What do you hope people get out of this book? What lessons do you really want them to learn as anti-war activists or people who haven't gotten quite involved yet? Um, and then follow up to that is where do you think the movement failed and where do you think it thrived? And if you want to go first.
Sure. Well, we keep electing people that continue war, no matter what their campaign is, a peace campaign that turns into war. So the role of Code Pink and other organizations that keep challenging our government is critical. And I think one of the strengths that Code Pink brings is to let everybody know that you have the right as a citizen of the United States or a resident of the United States to go into Congress and talk to congressional staff for sure. And then if you can catch a real live congressperson, generally in the hallway, that you have the opportunity to let your feelings be known. And it doesn't have to be that you have to disrupt Congress. You can do a variety of other things. And we've seen a huge increase in the numbers of groups that will come to Congress to lobby Congress for whatever issue it is. So I think that's one of the real strengths that Code Pink has had is to let the public know that it's your right to go into the Congress. It's your right to, for example, be out in front of the White House. The beginnings of Code Pink back in November of 2002, is that right, or 2001, was in front of the White House for like 4 months in the snow. And we've done various campouts, and we had a 30-day hunger strike in front of the White House to try to end the war on Iraq. Uh, it was called Bring the Troops Home Fast, and we were on the fast. So the role of peace organizations is very, very important to keep the idea of peace in front of the American public, because it certainly doesn't come out in our commercial media. Social media has certainly helped us out a lot, I think, in terms of being able to keep pushing peace and a real discussion in social media about the value of various organizations. So it's a different world than when Jeremy first started this book in 2001. Now that we are at 2026, 25 years later, it's a different way of communicating with our fellow citizens on the responsibilities and obligations that we have to challenge policies that we don't like. And I think we're doing a pretty good job in terms of highlighting what many of the issues are. It's just not the peace organizations, it's the collective that happens in a community where many people are trained through the peace organizations to now confront things that are going on. For example, in many of the cities of the United States, and particularly, of course, now in Minneapolis, we see the organizing ability coming out. And when you really probably get back to the actual people that are doing behind the scenes organizing, they probably had their start in peace, in the peace movement and trying to stop the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. So it's a great value that we have with these organizations.
Thank you, Anne. Jeremy, do you want to share on this question?
I mean, sure. So, like in its totality, the war on terror was an enormous crime and tragedy that claimed 1 million lives as a direct consequence of US interventions, 4 million lives as an indirect consequence. Many, many more, sort of severely wounded. And we have to have an attitude of never again. Shall we so recklessly plunge into, neo-imperial bids for American power that end up creating victims the world over and ultimately, weaken the United States. And then one thing I show in the book is that lots of thoughtful, conscientious people predicted the disaster that the war on terror became. And they weren't, listened to. And the dissident voice was diminished and dismissed and ridiculed, even though the sort of prophecy of catastrophe was completely borne out by what, unfolded. And there is something like an Iraq syndrome, like there was a Vietnam syndrome sort of hovering over this country, a reticence to involve ourselves again in major military conflicts. Even Trump feels that to a degree, but it's fragile and it could fall apart at any moment for reasons of vanity, bloodlust, insult, whatever happens to be moving Trump. And they've renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War. And there's a kind of bellicosity sort of surging, through Washington, eager to punish sort of someone somewhere with the unparalleled might of the US, military. And we're in a very precarious moment where the intensity and the scale of state violence that will be unleashed is, sort of to be determined. And we need popular mobilization in the halls of Congress, in the streets, in the churches, synagogues, mosques, in the universities to try to inhibit the state from engaging in more reckless violence. And then, one point I've been trying to make is that in some sense, the United States sort of already is at war. And then in a way, the primary war is the one Trump is waging against the American people through these targeted occupations in Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, etc., going after America as though it's a soft target, right? Where immigrants and their defenders have little capacity to resist, at least by means of arms. But there is the power of civil society resistance. And I think there have been some stunning and inspiring lessons in how people power can, constrain, the agenda of a predatory foe by showing that their conduct is illegal, inhumane, indecent. And then just in the last week or so, you can sort of feel this spirit of refusal and resistance, rising in this country. And then may, its spirit continue to grow. And then, the anti-war movement like didn't achieve its primary objective of stopping two wars before they started, but it did succeed in limiting the intensity and the duration of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as a consequence, like lives were saved. So even when it seems futile and hopeless, resistance is always worth it for the sake of one's own self-respect and ultimately because you're in all likelihood limiting the extent of suffering in the world. And I would put, protests of Israel's policies in Gaza in that. Like the death toll is, absolutely horrifying. But we all know that it would have been worse, but for the condemnation of people around the world and in the United States.
Yeah, the crime of anti-war activists is always being right too early. We've had this issue on Palestine when Code Pink took on Palestine. So many people got mad at us over it. People get angry at us over our stance on China, the common sense opinion that we shouldn't go to war on China. Um, but anti-war organizing is never going to be like instant gratification. I think that's something that I reflect on a lot. Because I don't know, we live in a world of instant gratification. It's normal to like when you need something in the US, be able to get it, Amazon, go to the store around the corner, something like that. Um, and something that I think about often is every time a new poll comes out in the US about war, it's like overwhelmingly Americans don't support it. And not just they don't support, sending troops over. They oppose the reasons the US government is saying they want war, which I think is sort of like a new phenomenon. And it's hard to find wins in the anti-war movement because like how do you celebrate a war if it didn't like celebrate stopping a war if it never started. Um, you know, it's almost self-defeating sometimes, but like that the arc of the anti-war movement is like really something to find, I think, immense hope in. Because I think, you two, all the people on this call who've been involved with Code Pink for 2 decades at this point have really made it possible. So that's really, really beautiful. Um, and something to reflect on for everyone. But I do want to make time for the discussion portion. So I'm wondering if Grace could unspotlight us so we could see everyone's beautiful faces. Almost there. Just Anne's beautiful face. Okay. Awesome. Um, So I want to take questions from the audience. I got a couple in the chat privately sent to me, but I do hope we can get a conversation going. Yeah, Razan, thank you for raising your hand so quick. I appreciate
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Rizan. I'm a PhD student and my research interests are in the War on Terror. Specifically, I look at the collective memory of state violence against Muslims during the War on Terror. So the cases I focus on most are of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, but broadly, just state violence against Muslims during the War on Terror and how it's been like preserved or like more accurately faded from the collective memory. And so I really love this book. And I feel like I have a million questions to ask, but I'm not going to do that to everybody here. So I'm going to ask one. Um, but I really appreciate just the existence of the book itself as a preservation of this memory that I'm studying the fading of. And so that's one thing, just the appreciation of this existence and the preservation of this collective memory, which you yourself in the introduction point out that it is fading, which is such a tragedy, especially like current Palestinian organizers, the young ones. I feel like a lot of them don't realize that the legacy of anti-war activism comes out of the anti-war activism in these years that you're detailing, which I think is a real tragedy that some of the most prominent like anti-war activists who are like college students are not realizing what their lineage is of their activism. And so I guess my question would be like, why do you think this is? And maybe you can answer the whole point of my dissertation for me in this one go. But but yeah, I maybe just like some reflections, like why do you think it has faded so fast in a single generation? Like it really feels like overnight that this generation doesn't know all of this basically. And maybe you can give some reflections on the reasons why it is and like how we can do better to preserve it besides this.
Mhm.
Great question. That's amazing.
I mean, thank you for your question, and then thank you so much for, writing the dissertation that you're writing. And then right off the bat, I would like to recommend a book that you may or may not be aware of called Innocent Until Proven Muslim by a colleague of mine, Maha
I
Halal.
love Meha.
Yes. And then she's a dear friend and was heavily involved in Witness Against Torture. And then she dives into the Muslim, Arab American piece of it more thoroughly than, I do. Um, you know, in telling the story of the anti-war movement, I wanted to spark broader reflection on the history of the war on terror that does feel like it's vanished without a trace, almost like the Iraq War never happened at all. And this is so very different from my experience growing up in the wake of the Vietnam War. I was born in 1967, caught the tail end as a young boy. But deep into my adolescence and young adulthood, Vietnam had a massive presence in American culture, in cinema, in music, in political, discourse, as if the whole country recognized that we had been through something momentous and traumatic and divisive that had to be studied and worked through. There needed to be healing. There needed to be recognition of the sacrifice of the veterans and all of the afflictions that they came home with. There needed to be some kind of rapprochement with, Vietnam, a turning of American foreign policy towards human rights, which Carter sort of briefly tried. And then, here we are, however many years out from 9/11, and it feels like there's so little of that. And then it's always difficult to account for an absence, right? And that's part of your challenge in your dissertation. How do you interpret, silence? And then my master interpretation is that the story of the anti-war movement is so little told because the broader story of the war on terror is so little told because it was so painful, so divisive, so complicated in its outcome, so injurious to a sense of national purpose and national unity that we simply don't know what to do with it. Right? So it's this sort of traumatic wound that is sort of bleeding all over us. And the easiest thing is to, deny that we're even hurt. And then the difficult thing is that you can avoid conscious recognition of a legacy while still experiencing the toxic effects of that wound. And the war on terror is, in a sense, making a comeback, even insofar as Trump is deeply weaponizing all kinds of executive powers and racist tropes and discourses of the other to make war on migrants. So the brown-skinned Muslim foreign terrorist evil jihadi has been replaced by the brown-skinned Spanish-speaking criminal rapist murderer dog-eating, immigrant. And in a sense, it's the same racist frame applied to a new set of people. And then the premise in both cases is that the survival of a certain conception of America means closing countries off from people bearing that threat, locking them up, detaining them, terrorizing them, humiliating them, stripping them of rights. And there are frightening parallels between Guantanamo and a lot of the migrant detention centers, destroying these boats off of Venezuela, the same premise as for the drone strikes, that anyone we designate as a terrorist enemy can be assassinated anywhere in the world without any, hint of due process. And then this sense that the executive, as the commander in chief of this war, has limitless power to wage it as, in this case, he likes, without meaningful congressional oversight or meaningful constraint from, civil society or the law. So it's a tricky situation where the memory has been repressed, but some of the worst aspects of the war on terror that we need to honestly interrogate, deal with, work through, revise, refine, are with us. And I think more and more people are sort of making connections, then and now. And then the Islamophobia piece, I mean, you probably know more about this than I do, but I would say one very positive sign is the election of Mamdani in New York City. And they tried to sort of terrorist bait him. You support Hamas, you're, really a jihadi, da, da, da. And New Yorkers, by and large, weren't buying it. No, he's a New Yorker with like South Asian origin, like lots of people around us. And like that's okay because that's who we are. And we are proudly pluralistic and proudly diverse and don't run this narrative about him as a way to, discredit him. So that's a little kind of green shoot of hope. And then some of the contemporary activism against immigrants does make kind of public recognition that Muslim, Arab American, South Asian Americans experienced a lot of this not so long ago. And then the various communities have a lot to teach and learn from, one another within a larger solidarity movement.
And if I could just add, I think, as new people come into movements and as new people, for like the example, the encampments at universities on the issue of Gaza, or fighting back against ICE, sometimes the new people that are coming into this, they are so consumed by the day-to-day, how do you get people out on the streets, how do you organize, that doing something like reading back on history, how other groups have done it, they just don't have time for it. I will say that they are in some ways no different from the federal government because after every war, there are lessons learned. There are volumes of what went wrong. And when another war starts up, nobody reads the lessons learned. And I think in a way, because the young activists, new activists are so consumed with what they're doing on a day-to-day basis that the lessons learned by other movements aren't really there until several years later when they have a chance to take a breath. Thank you.
That was a great question, Razan, and I'm wondering if you have had any insights in your research that you would want to share with everyone.
Oh, you're letting me yap about my research. Don't do that. I'll never stop talking. Um, yeah, it's the question that I'm setting out to answer, so I guess the problem is I don't have answers quite yet. But I guess so far I'm finding that there is a sense, there's a you read these sources, you read these like statements and these reflections from the very people who are perpetrating this violence, like Bush himself or the Bush administration, Dick Cheney, or like just people who worked very closely with them, things like that. And you see the sense that like they very much recognize that they're in a pivotal point in history. Like a lot of them say like, oh, history is gonna look at us like this and that. Like this comes up a lot.
Mm.
So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I have two people way more experienced in this side of the world than me, but I I just get the sense that they very much recognized that history will look back on them and they reacted to it in ways that like they were aware that they had to frame their actions in certain ways to ensure that they were not seen as the villains in history, I suppose is part of the reflection I'm coming to, and I'll see where I build off of that from. I think the other thing is they were very attuned to like symbols of violence, for example. Like I told you, I focus a lot on these torture prisons, like at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, and there was a plan briefly to demolish the Abu Ghraib prison because they thought that it's such a symbol, a notorious symbol of violence that they thought it should be gotten rid of altogether. And of course, you have these Iraqis that react like, what the heck, you're gonna spend millions of dollars to, and the plan, it was a crazy plan. They never did it. But the plan was to demolish the prison and build another maximum security prison on top of that. So a lot of Iraqis reacted like, you're going to spend millions of dollars to demolish this prison and build a new one, and there's no change in policy. So like, what's the point of spending these millions of dollars to destroy something and just build a new version of it where you're still going to be torturing people? I'm sorry, I'm yapping, but like a point is there was this I finding this big like symbolism that was very important to them, that they didn't see how impractical this was because the symbol of violence, the visual symbol, felt so important to them.
Yeah. And Razan, if you email me, I can send you. We did a lot of work around the 20th anniversary of 9/11 that talked about the war on terror in 2021. And we had like a bunch of programming around that with a bunch of activists that if you find any of them particularly useful for your research, I could probably connect you with them.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually organizing something myself at my current university for the 25th anniversary of the War on Terror. And yeah, connecting over that would be great. Connecting with Jeremy and Anne would also be amazing. So putting myself out there.
Yeah, I'm gonna put my email in the chat if you, and this is goes for anyone who has questions that we don't get to. I put my email in the chat for anyone. I do want to get to the questions that were asked before we started the discussion, so I don't leave people hanging who put their questions in early. But um, there were two. Okay.
And there's a
What?
couple of hands up also. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you? This is for both of you, I think. Make of when there were millions of people in the street and on that, I think one big day of action or a couple. What did you make of it then, and how do you reflect on it now?
I mean, right. So the questioner is referring to massive worldwide protests on February 15th, 2003. So roughly 6 weeks before the war started. And then people rallied under the slogan, "The world says no to more," says no to war. Between 15 and 30 million people turned out on all seven continents in thousands of cities, and it remains to this day the largest coordinated protest in, human history, begging Bush and Blair not to launch the threatened war. Code Pink was heavily involved for organizing that, as was United for Peace and Justice, and it kindled real hope that voices for peace rising in a giant chorus would make Bush and Blair, think twice. And it was the kind of high watermark of the anti-war movement, which in a way reached its peak before the war even started. And then unfortunately, the war makers went ahead with their plans, leaving a lot of people incredibly dispirited, believing that democracy was broken if the voice of the people can be so, easily ignored. But that didn't mean that people exited the movement. They just planned for the long haul. And over a matter of years, through grinding advocacy work, tried to, chip away at public support for the war, chip away at congressional support for the war, and eventually bring it to an end. And the anti-war movement was profoundly right in knowing the time to stop a war is before it starts, right? Because once a war starts, there's such a commitment of resources and institutions and propaganda and political, capital, behind it. And then I think America, learned that grim truth that once you commit to death and destruction in a serious way, the suffering escalates before it can then, diminish. So the organizing behind the event was a tremendous achievement that made highly visible, global dissent, but is also itself a sign of how little our leaders were committed to heeding the voice of fellow Americans.
Mhm. And I'll mention I was in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. I was the deputy ambassador there, and even in Mongolia, there was a demonstration. And that was the last month. 1 month later, I ended up resigning. And, reading the newspaper accounts of how many people were challenging the war. And by that time, I'd already sent in a dissent cable into Washington saying I thought this was a very bad idea for the Bush administration. And I think it helped propel me for my decision to go ahead and resign from the government. There were two other people that resigned prior to the start of the Iraq War, and I think the mobilization of citizens around the world had a great deal to do with all three of us resigning. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Anne. Um, all right. I think this might have to be our last question. But if people want to put in remaining questions in the chat, we can try and circle back to it because I do want to give time to close out. Um, Question for both Jeremy and Anne, as you both speak on different perspectives on joining and following anti-war organizing. Can you speak to the importance of joining an organized group when doing this kind of work? Why does community and groups like Code Pink and VFP, Veterans for Peace, organizing with people next to you matter, especially amidst such a terrifying landscape of war and surveillance?
Okay, great. I mean, and then first, let me give a brief shout out to Ray Abalia, who was, I believe, the Code Pink national director for, many years, starting around 2008. And Ray is a major character in the book, whom I interviewed at length. We became friends, and thanks so much for showing up. And you can learn more about Ray if you read the book. And then I'm a big believer in the importance of organization. And then so little can be accomplished, on one's own. And then when you're part of a group, you develop an immense loyalty to its vision, its mission, and the people in it who become friends and comrades who teach you and learn from you and give you love and affection and motivate you through the example of their own commitment. I mean, I was for years part of this group called Witness Against Torture with sort of roots in the Catholic left. And it was an intense, beloved community. And the power of our own community was what propelled us in pursuit of our shared goals, to which we had an almost religious sense of devotion. How is each of us contributing to the cause and upholding the standards and the ethics of our own group? And, organization is and can be a very powerful thing. I mean, and then Code Pink developed a very distinctive and powerful culture. And being a member of Code Pink, meant and continues to mean something to people. It becomes an identity in the world that grounds you and gives you a sense of purpose. And, throughout human history, progress has been made when often small groups of people join in intense commitment to something that they all, value. And may that story continue.
Yeah, and if you don't join up with a group, you're going to go crazy staying at home. So it's really important that you are with people, uh, help share the wealth of the burden that you have on your shoulders of what's going on in the world. And groups like Code Pink Women for Peace, Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War. I mean, there's a whole group of folks, and I too want to shout out to Ray because we've been through a lot of crazy things with Old Code Pink, and it's it puts a smile on your face when you get up in the morning and you can see what some Code Pinkers have done, and things like Medea going after all of those congressmen and what happens with that, or various people and different parts of the country and the creative things that that they come up with, and it's because it's a collective effort. And so working with the collective is much more rewarding than trying to figure out how you as an individual can affect anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Jeremy. I do want to recognize we have 2 minutes left, so I do think we have to start wrapping it up, but please look in the chat. I put my email in there. I'm happy to facilitate any questions afterwards as well. We do want to keep building up this community. And like Anne and Jeremy said, joining an organization is incredibly important for your own sanity and for this longevity of the movement. And if you're not part of an organization and you like Code Pink, you can join Code Pink, codepink.org/peacemaker. We have chapters and a whole dedicated staff that support our chapters around the country who are organizing locally. And even if you're thinking, I'm not an organizer, I don't know what I would do. Um, there are millions of transferable skills in your daily life that we need in the peace movement. And you can find your niche with us because we need everyone involved. We need as many people as possible. And we need to be in community with each other. So I really want to thank Jeremy and Anne for joining us tonight. It was so I feel like we had a very intergenerational discussion, which I think is necessary. Like Rezan had pointed out, I do think people my age don't generally understand what the anti-war movement entailed in that period. So please, everyone, and Jeremy, you could speak more to this. Get your copy. Our grief is not a cry for war. It's wonderful. I read it on the train across country. It was beautiful. But Jeremy, where can people get their hands on the book? And is there anything else you'd like to plug?
I mean, I would say anywhere but Amazon.
Yep. True, true, true.
Through
Okay.
a local bookstore or directly from the publisher, and then there's a Code Pink discount code, of some substantial amount. So, and then the book is much more extensive than an hour-long conversation can convey. But thanks so much for organizing this, Danica, and for all the wonderful people on the call.
Thank you. And thank you, Anne.
A pleasure to be with you. And, Jody and Medea all wanted to be here, but they were in various and sundry places. Medea's in Cuba right now. Jody, I have no idea where she is, but I was honored to be able to be a part of the Code Pink Book Club. Yay.
Thank you. And if you didn't get your hands on the book, but you RSVP'd to this event, you should have gotten a link to buy the book with the code that Jeremy was talking about. So just try and find that in your email, or you can email me and I'll get back to you about it.
It's
But
also
yeah.
in the chat right now. I just put it in the chat.
Thank you, Grace. Grace is the best. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful night. And thank you for this wonderful discussion. Peace.
Bye. Thank you.